Dr. Perrin, who I think is appearing online.
Okay, I'm hoping I'm online at the moment.
You are, we can see and hear you. Welcome.
I'm about to try and screen share. Are you getting that screen outline of my presentation?
Not yet, but sometimes it takes a little while to come up.
Okay, we'll try again.
Sometimes it takes a little while to come up, so let's just wait for a little while. Seems to be coming up now.
I'll see if I can. Now, are you seeing an outline of a presentation at the moment?
Yep, that's good. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, panel members. My name is Dr. Simon Perrin. I'm a member of the Bendigo District Environment Council. I'm a retired anaesthetist, retired from anaesthetic practice in 2016 and retired from all medical practice in 2021. How anaesthesia relates to mining is in the basic sciences of anaesthesia. Clinical physiology and pharmacology are the primary subjects studied to a basic level of or postgraduate master's level. And that feeds into toxicology, which is where my interest in mining came. And I'll show you some examples as we talk. There's a stanza in anaesthesia that we teach to young anaesthetists: trust no one, believe no one, and give oxygen. Basically, that just means check every fact for yourself, don't believe what you're told. In my presentation, I'll discuss very briefly BDEC's history and how we came to be involved with mining, some comments on nuclei contamination and dust dispersion, some comments on accepting consultants' advice, again coming back to trust no one, believe no one, and then a brief description of regulatory failure that we've seen mostly across Bendigo but also elsewhere. Excuse me. BDEC's origins date back to about 1987 when Western Mining was planning to dig for gold underneath Bendigo's water supply. Back then we were called Friends of the Forests, and we campaigned vigorously and presented at the EES back then, and essentially that EES was refused. And since then we've done 11 mining EESs, 6 outside Bendigo, and personally I've been involved in 6 of those 11 mining EESs. BDEC has a fairly extensive qualification list amongst its members. I won't read through them. There are a couple of people that have now retired, including one gentleman that had a PhD in quantum mechanics. But they're happy to be used as our brains trust. If we've got any queries or need to check up something, we talk to them. The members of BDEC have been employed in various projects for local council, state governments, Environment Victoria, Land Conservation Council, which I think is now called VAC. One member worked for UNESCO, he's now retired. And there are 3 local field naturalists or ecologists, each with over 30 years experience. The next thing I'd like to go on and discuss is just the challenge to participate. For a not highly educated, tertiary educated community, when you get hit with an EES document, it's just an extraordinary challenge. Just the sheer volume, 5,000 pages. And in this case, there's still multiple bits of missing information. Your RFI document, I think, had something like 100 questions. After that, you end up with 220 table documents, and the community's left with 12 weeks to get across all that material, try and work out where the errors are, and then respond within that period. The other complicating factor is onus of proof. And this comes up from the fingerboards inquiry, when Mr. Stuart Morris, SC, I think, former judge from the Supreme Court, he made a comment about onus of proof, and basically the application of the concept of onus of proof is particularly apposite in the context of administrative inquiry, because essentially because the inquiry is fact-finding and the minister is not obliged to make any decisions. So translated, that means there's no rules of evidence, which means consultants are free to essentially not be completely truthful or completely honest, which makes the challenge for a community even harder to recognise where any errors or misstatements, deliberate or otherwise, are made. There are multiple other challenges for a community to participate. Financial assistance, and it's not tax deductible for the community, unlike the company. There's no legal or advocacy assistance for most people. There's an inherent assumption that landowners are tech savvy. As you can tell from my experience, we're not. And the EES decision is a life-changing consequences for people who are regarded as sensitive receptors. The process is destructive for community. The people that are challenging the mining companies, they have to hold down employment, run businesses, run families, and at the same time respond to the EES, which is basically done in their leisure time. So their entire life is paralysed for 5 months through an EES process. And this process splits the community into those that believe they're going to profit from the mine versus those who are about to have their lives uprooted if the mine proceeds. So they're basically the reasons BDEC gets involved to help these communities. I'll skip that one. After the other problem with EES is not the process itself, is what happens after the process. The perilous state of Earth resources and other regulators. They're under-resourced, undermanned, undereducated, and I'm not convinced their motivation is to protect society, safety, or assets. They're failed regulators, and that applies to, I'll extend that to the EPA and the Health Department when it comes to managing mines. After the EES, there's work plan variations, which I think Mr. McGee touched on. What you think is planned turns out to be an entirely different beast, and any changes requested by the mining company is essentially ticked off by the regulators who don't understand engineering as a whole, and whatever the company puts before them, they just tick off. It appears their motivation is promotion of mining rather than safety, as I mentioned before. Environmental review committees have been all but disbanded, and any committees with community members that are conscientious and check out some details outside of what the company presents are usually just immediately shut down. We've got multiple examples around Bendigo where that's happened. And what we don't know is about to happen is amendments to the MRSD Act and the Planning Act. It appears that's going to move some regulation or more regulation on the councils. It's unclear exactly how that's going to apply. And that's likely to contribute to a very different mining beast to what's being proposed in any EES process. I'll move on to radiation now. Just a few comments about radiation. This is a study or a report by the International Association for Research on Cancer, and they studied internally ingested or inhaled radionuclides, And this was, I think, about 2001 they produced this. And their comment on page 79 in summary is internalized radionuclides that emit alpha particles are carcinogenic to humans, group 1 carcinogens. Now, sorry, I'm just getting in trouble with my screen here, that's better. And what that means is thorium, uranium, radon are all alpha emitters. And if they're ingested or inhaled, they are carcinogenic. And there's absolutely no doubting about their carcinogenic potential. This is an article from the British Medical Journal, and it backs up what Professor Tillman is presenting. And this was done about August last year. And the important sentence in this article is excess relative rate of solid cancer mortality per grade is larger than estimates currently informing radiation protection, and some evidence suggests it has a steeper slope in the dose response association in the low dose range. You may remember Professor Tillman talking about that steep slope at the beginning of a dose versus cancer rate graph. And it now appears that the current, as he stated, the current levels of recommended for protection are grossly inadequate. And like all scientific analyses progressing to practice, there's often a 5 or 10 year delay. We see this frequently in medicine. Often it's more than 10, even up to 20 years before what's known actually ends up in practice. And here we've got an example that Mr. Tillman Professor Tillman highlighted, which makes it difficult for any EES panel to say, well, what level of safety are we regarding for the community when we now know this is the problem, but the current recommendations are much laxer. Now, this is what was presented at this was in the report of the panel members from the fingerboards panel hearing. In chapter 8 of their findings, the IAC finds there's a high likelihood of significant dust impacts at sensitive receptors. Dust sources could include HMC stockpiles. We've heard nothing about the HMC stockpiles here, except some vague comment about a 3-sided shed. And further on in their findings, which is their findings on radioactivity, chapter 10, and I think it was section 4.4. And this is a very important finding. It seems like every time we do an EES, we reinvent the wheel. If HMC is stockpiled, it should be in a totally sealed system, preventing water egress, and is capable of containing and treating any water runoff and ensuring that HMC is not lost to wind erosion. And then in chapter 13, a similar comment about wind erosion. During extreme conditions, the surface may dry and be subjected to creep. Sprinklers will be established as a contingency to maintain moisture. We've heard nothing about Gippsland's rather wetter than Mallee, and we've heard nothing how this HMC is actually going to be contained. I do apologise, I'm having some screen problems here, in that there's pictures over my screen, so I can't see my entire screen. But in the, I think this is in the ASX update, we get the volumes of what is going to be produced. And the reason I'm presenting this is the amount of HMC produced per annum, which is 134,000 tonnes per atom, excuse me. Now, for some reason, they have to stockpile 1/4 of that annual production, that is 35,000 tonnes. They're going to need a shed somewhere of the size 50 metres by 20 metres by 20 metres high. The 35,000 tonnes will have a volume of about 10,000 cubic metres. And when you try and work out how that will actually work, you can see the size of the, it won't be the storage will have to be in some sort of pyramidal shape, and you end up with this sort of structure. Which brings me then on to, if you've got a height of 20 metres, just what's going to happen with the particles or dust particles if they happen to be exposed to wind. At some stage, they're going to have to dry the HMC. We've yet to hear exactly how that's going to happen. So on this graph, I think Mr. McGee showed it briefly, or this table. The important figure here is that 16.6. Now that's a 100 micron particle of lead. But lead's about the same consistency or density as HMC. And you'll see that's a lift-off velocity. And that lift-off velocity is 60 kilometres per hour. Looking at the last calendar year and the maximum wind gusts at Swan Hill over the last calendar year, 47 days were greater than 50 kilometres per hour, 15 days were greater than 60 kilometres an hour, 6 days greater than 70, 3 days greater than 80. In other words, there were 70 days in the year where the heavy HMC particles were susceptible to wind elevation. And when you describe wind elevation and you try to work out how far the particles will travel, you use this formula, which is basically Stokes' law. And when you actually plot this out, this is a complicated graph, which I apologise for. It was modelled for me by Professor Peter Wycheck at Wollongong University and his offsider, Dr. John Roberts. They ran the modelling for me. And so the blue line is 30 micron particles. The green line is 50 micron particles. As you'll be aware, HMC tends to sit between 30 and 100 microns. But I want you to focus on the grey line. So on the bottom axis, we've got wind speed, and particularly focus on the 50 kilometre per hour. On the left-hand side, we've got the distance travelled. So a 30 micron particle of HMC stacked 20 metres high. Remember the diagram I showed before? And that particle will travel in a 50 kilometre hour wind. That particle will travel in a 10 metre pile, that particle will travel 1.5 kilometres. On a 20 metre pile, that particle will travel 3 kilometres before it settles. That's a 3 kilometre circle around the mine site. The star in the middle is near the processing plant, which I'm assuming is where the HMC is going to be stored, but we're not actually told that. Remember, this is a 50 kilometre hour wind. An 80 kilometre hour wind, you can add another 50% to that circle. And I'll stop my talk on radiation about there and move on. I know everyone's keen to get back to Melbourne for the long weekend. An observant person might have noticed the gold circle on that table regarding lift-off velocities, and for dirt and a 10 micron particle. So we're talking about all those piles of overburden and topsoil. the liftoff velocity for a 10 micron particle there is 12 kilometers per hour. When you think about you've got a 20 or 30 metre high pile of dirt, we're not quite sure how big that's going to be. I think there were talk of 10 or maybe 30. And when you translate that in a 50 kilometre hour wind, you end up with a potential settling distance of somewhere around 15 kilometres for a 10 metre pile. If you make that a 20 metre pile, potential PM dust settling range is in the order of 30 kilometres. I'm sorry, the top's not filled in on that map. That was the best I could find at the time to suit the diameters. And the IAC in chapter 8 talking about dust at the fingerboards panel hearing, they considered that dust mitigation measures proposed are likely to be totally ineffective, particularly in periods of hot, dry weather. The diagrams have demonstrated the area of potential impact. Now, this is Gippsland. I think the Mallee's slightly drier and slightly hotter, which suggests there's very likely to be a dust problem. I'd like to move on now and just talk about accepting consultants' advice unchallenged. Again, it's a matter of trust no one, believe no one. In accepting consultants' opinions, there's a few things to consider. One, their focus. Two, their reliability. The onus of proof, which I've already mentioned. There are no rules of evidence. They're essentially allowed to say anything they'd like to or that suits their employer. And they have a future employment risk if they don't say what their employer requires. There's also no enforceable code of conduct. In essence, they end up, I think it was Mr. McCumber that suggested that most consultants are advocates for the proponents rather than dependent or working for the IAC. And the first problem of consultants is focus. They each see a different part of the picture. They're usually so specialised that they can't assess the data that's actually handed to them and whether that data is likely to be accurate. They have great difficulty in then extending that, what they know, to what happens in the rest of the mine and whether what their input's going to be is actually how things will turn out in the end. This is an article by Driscoll, and it was a survey of about 300 environmental consultants of various employment statuses, universities, private enterprise, government. And it was published in 2020. I'll skip their abstract. I'll go straight to their findings. And what they found that in government, 34, and in industry, 30% of respondents reported interference in what they presented. And 1/3 of the respondents reported personal suffering related to suppressing those, including job losses. Compare that with the university respondents, where only 5% reported interference with what they were presenting. Most of those interferences were internal communications. 1/3 of those interferences were internal communications, and about 1/3 were for media presentations. I would submit that the internal communications between a consultant and their proponent are internal communications. This matters. This is a former BDEC member, retired mainly because of illness last year. But he was a professor at the University of Ontario, and he did a number of studies with his PhD candidates on levels of mercury in the Great Lakes of America. And essentially, this was the first one that was published and presented in a public arena. This resulted in the chloralkali industry of the Great Lakes of America being disbanded completely. Subsequent after that, it wasn't able to work in America or Canada, now in Australia. And it has been a VDEC member for 20, 30 years. Again, onus of proof is a major problem for the community, not the consultants, but for the community, because the community don't know whether the evidence given by consultants is completely accurate. I'd like to move on now to the regulatory failure, loss of control. So once an ES is improved, what happens after that is almost quite random, not for the company, but for the community. And I'll discuss it in four groups: the technical reference groups, rehabilitation, an example of rehabilitation, some examples of failed regulation, and the fourth one, amendments to the MRSD Act, Planning Act. So the first one is the technical reference group. I'm just stunned by what happened to the technical reference group for this project. I won't read out all the regulatory bodies that were involved. But here, on the second page, I think this was provided by the proponent. So we've got the EPA, Goulburn Murray Water, Grampians Water, Grampians, Wimmera and Mallee Water, Mallee Catchment Management Authority, North Central Catchment Management Authority on this body. We've got 2 Shire councils. Then we come up with this discrepancy in the permeability constant regarding how water travels through basically the Parilla sands. And the discrepancy was of 1 to 2 orders of magnitude. That's not out by 10% or 50% or even 100%. That's out by 10,000%. No one in those bodies, particularly the 4 water management bodies, noticed that figure. I just find that absolutely astounding. And it adds to the degree of difficulty for the panel, for the community. If they can't pick it up and get data changed, it makes it incredibly difficult for everyone else following on from there. And then we've got all the other information that just wasn't provided. The hydromet, what's happening with the HMC, it's gradually trickling out. But in the meantime, the community's got to do all the other things in life, as well as try and catch up with these dribbling bits of information, hearing from periodically. And then you've got to ask yourself, how on earth could this happen? Could be groupthink. I've already mentioned the ash experiment. I've just come across a very good YouTube video of that. I've put it down the bottom, explaining the ash experiment and how people can form in a group. And then there's potentially another elephant in the room that's operating when the TRG meets. So moving on to other regulatory problems. Rehabilitation. This is the panel report for the Deborah Gold Mine in Bendigo. And they were talking about the rehabilitation. The proposed use of the Culsharlton site is to return to box ironbark forest while retaining the area as an historic reserve. A significant proportion of the proposed rehabilitation will be completed during and immediately following declining development phase. There's progressive rehabilitation. 30 years on, I would maintain they never intended to do any rehabilitation. The government's now the proud owner of that site. There's $6 million in the bond, which I think Mr. McGee may have mentioned. We estimate it will cost $100 to $200 million to rehabilitate that site. Example number 2 is Costerfield. This is the Brunswick pit at Costerfield. Those water sprays are spraying 30 milligrams per litre of antimony. At the time they were doing this, antimony was considered a possible carcinogen. It's now been relabelled as a definite carcinogen, a group 1 carcinogen. Those sprays also contain 50 micrograms per litre of lead. Lead is also a carcinogen, but is also well recognised as a permanent neurotoxin in children, and it causes intellectual damage in children. It's fairly subtle, not picked up till they start failing in school, usually at secondary school level. The reason this is a regulatory problem, there were councils, water bodies, health departments, EPA, Earth Resources sitting on an ERC meeting talking about what was in these sprays. They still permitted them to go ahead, knowing there were children living within 200 metres of this site. So they're spraying 2 carcinogens and 1 permanent neurotoxin in the air within 200 metres of children in full knowledge of what they were doing. I think that's regulatory failure. When people started getting sick after about 2 years of doing this, they switched off the sprays, ran around, tested all, did an environmental analysis. Lo and behold, they found huge amounts of antimony and also significant quantities of lead. They talked about the antimony because at that stage it was only a possible carcinogen, and no one mentioned the lead. 2 years later, in their final report, in tables hidden about halfway through a 600-page document, there was the evidence of lead contamination. Why is that important? If you're checking for lead contamination, what you need to do is the moment you detect lead contamination, you've got to test children, do a blood test on children. Children will clear that lead basically within 6 months. Remember, this report didn't come out for 2 years. They missed the opportunity to test the children. The group that presumably decided not to test, that group was a committee established in Melbourne. Again, it had Earth Resources, EPA, Health Department, Solicitor General, and also a couple of professors of toxicology, I think. And they decided for 2 years not to release that data and presumably not to test those children. And I would submit they all knew better, or most of them should have known better. If they didn't, why didn't they? Next example is Woodvale. These are the Woodvale ponds. They're about 2 kilometres long and about 800 metres wide. The golden stars are where residences are. The red star is where arsenic is concentrated. Now, there's about 200,000 tonnes of salt sitting in these ponds, mostly dry now, and there's 100 tonnes of soluble inorganic arsenic, which is the most potent carcinogenic form of arsenic. And arsenic itself is one of the most potent carcinogens known to man. There's 100 tonnes of it sitting on the surface of this paddock. when they've done air tests, when the paddock dries out, it's elevated in the dust. They did dust monitoring around 2018, high volume dust monitoring. Lo and behold, they exceeded the acceptable thresholds in that high volume dust monitoring. What was the response of the regulators? They stopped testing it. In 2015, they did an environmental analysis of the area and discovered arsenic in 80% of, I think it was 79% of the water tanks being having no reticulated water. Everyone out there needs rainwater tanks, and within a 1 kilometre radius of those ponds, 80%, roughly 80% of the rain tanks had water in them. The only way they could had arsenic in them, the only way that could occur is if there was arsenic in the dust. But as I said, the regulator's response was just to stop testing for dust. The environmental report recommended that sprinklers be placed on these ponds when dry, and that they continue high volume air monitoring or air sampling. That essentially hasn't been done for 5 years now. And the last example is Fosterville. Beware Greeks bearing gifts. Fosterville's been very generous with the local tennis complex, which holds international competitions. It's also very generous to council. Council is a regulator of the Fosterville mine, or one of the regulators of the Fosterville mine, and I can't help but think there might be some conflict of interest in accepting money from a mine they're also supposed to be regulating. And here's the problem. This mine started off about the size of that little red circle, started a bit to about halfway down that yellow line to the left is where that mine originally started, quite small. And over the 30 years, there's 30 years since that was approved in an EES, that mine has extended out to become 6 kilometres long. Regulatory failure, there's never been any EES other than the first EES for the first open cut mine. The extension that's occurred over 6 kilometres has happened without any further EES process. And Ian described that tailings dam, which if it collapses, will take out the Murray River, probably to Swan Hill, even Mildura. At that stage, that's primarily my talk. So just quickly recapping, there's all these decisions that happen after an EES, a reflection on what the panel approved. If the panel approves this EES, what happens afterward virtually has no reflection on what was presented or what's been presented today. It's the onus of proof. We don't know what is true and what's not true as things are presented from consultants. And if HMC is stockpiled, it should be in a totally sealed system, because it is susceptible to dust, to wind elevation, and hence spreading to local water tanks. And it can spread quite a big distance. If you're stockpiling at 20 metres, 3 kilometre range isn't out of the ordinary. And if you're talking about silica, it may have a range of up to 30, 40 kilometres of PM10 particles from stockpiled, overburden and topsoil. And with that, I'll say thank you for your time, and returning to the anaesthetic stanza, trust no one, believe no one. When it comes to mining, I would add, follow the money. So thank you for your time, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen. And I'll conclude there, and hopefully you've got time to get back to Melbourne for the long weekend.
Thanks, Dr. Perrin. Just for the record, the IOC doesn't approve the project. That's the role of
I
the minister.
appreciate that. Sorry, yes.
We make a recommendation about whether it
You
should be
make the
approved or not.
recommendation. Sorry, yes, I appreciate that.
No, that's fine. Thanks. Look, I'll just go to my colleagues and ask if they have any questions. Mr. McIntosh. Ms. Bell, do you have any questions? No. Thanks, Dr. Perrin. We don't have any questions. Your submissions were clear. Thank you.
Thank you very